call this the top square. The inner bailey. The royal heart of Stirling. And in fact, it's the royal heart of Scotland. This is courtyard. These buildings here is effectively the capital of Scotland for several hundred years. This building behind me is the Great Hall. We're going to look inside there shortly. This is the Chapel Royal. And again, we'll look inside there shortly. This building over here, we call it the King's Road building. I'll tell you why in a minute. And then come over this way, you've got a couple of castle ghosts just heading in the door there. We have, again, the palace of James V of Scotland, and a better view of those statues again. The best wall of the statues. Now remember I said outside, the first wall is anarchy, bad government. The second wall is religions dispelling the evil. So now we have good government, according to James V. So in the corner, the left-hand side, there he is, the bearded old man, that is him, James V himself. We'll come back to him in a minute. The next statue along, the young man is carrying a cup. Now all these statues are based on the idea of the Greek and Roman gods. This is Ganymede, who was the cup-bearer to the ancient gods, and represents peace and prosperity for all. The next statue is Venus, goddess of love. Actually, this is quite touching. Follow the statue to its base. You can see at the bottom there's a very heavily weathered figure. At the bottom, difficult to make it out. Time has not been kind to that statue. But then life is not kind to the person it represents. That is Madeleine, Princess of France, James V's first wife. Now Scotland and France have been allies for centuries. It's a diplomatic marriage. James is trying to renew that alliance. But it's more than that. Young Madeleine was 17, she was beautiful, well educated and very rich. And James was in love. She comes to Scotland and she was dead in 2 months. Tuberculosis, I'm afraid, the Scottish climate, and it was June, killed her. And James is heartbroken. This is his tribute to his first wife. She never saw it. Made long after her death. You notice I said first wife. For although he is heartbroken, he's a king, and if nothing else, he has to produce an heir. But he's also after an alliance with France again. So he goes back to France. For some strange reason, the French king won't give him another daughter to marry. Can't think why. But he marries a member of a very powerful French family called Marie de Guise. Now Marie was considered quite a catch. At this point, Henry VIII in England, he of the 6 wives, did not have it chopping their heads off. He just finished with wife number 3. He was looking for wife number 4 and gave Marie the offer of a lifetime. And she said no. Actually, what she said to him was, her answer officially was, I'm a big woman, but with a small neck. I like her. So she marries James, becomes the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. Young Mary became queen at the age of 7 days. 1 week old, her father dies at 30. She's now the queen. A sickly child, not like to live. She did live, of course, but it was touch and go for a while. So she grows up here in Stirling Castle until she's 6. Her mother, a French woman in a foreign land, barely speaks a language, stepped in. She became the regent of Scotland on her daughter's behalf, as it turned out, for the next 19 years. It was one of the best governments this country's ever had. And during her time, well, young Mary grows up here, but then she goes off to France. She grows up in the French court. She marries the heir to the French throne. It's called Francois. In due course, she marries Francois. Francois becomes king, I should say, and they become king and queen of France and of Scotland. Francois dies. Mary comes back to Scotland, a widow, at 90s. Start again, pick up the pieces. I think most people are aware of at least part of that story. It's very tragic, very romantic. But what people don't realise is the full implications of that story, because you see, in those days, a woman cannot own property in her own right, can't be trusted with complicated matters. So an heiress, when she marries, everything she owns becomes the property of her husband. Mary is the Queen of Scots. When she marries the heir to the French throne, Scotland becomes part of France. We are French. In 1557, the Treaty of Haddington is signed, and Scotland and France become one nation in the same way that Britain and France is one nation. One set of money, one set of laws, one language, all French, one monarch. Henry II of France Mary's father-in-law, who's going to look after Scotland, so she doesn't have to worry her pretty little head. Now in reality it's not going to work, because although Scotland and France, we've been allies for centuries, we've got cultural links, trade links, family ties, the one thing we've really got in common is the English. Take them out of the equation. It's not going to work. And within 3 years, when he's back here in Scotland, France got a new king, we're separate. However, that treaty of 1557 has never been repealed. We're still French. Bonjour. Actually, one day I must learn more of that language than just bonjour. However, the next statue, a bearded man carrying a purse. Saturn. Saturn represents the golden age, the good old days. Actually, the darker message in that, follow the pillar down, at the bottom you've got a statue of a man strangling a snake with his left hand. This, 1530s, Scotland along with the rest of Europe is religion-wise is Catholic. But the Reformation has started, the new Protestant message is taking root, especially here in Scotland. James is the last Catholic king of Scotland. What he's saying is to go back to the good old days, from represented by Saturn, strangle those Protestant heretics now. Actually, he didn't. He threatened it. He threatened his Catholic bishops as well, for that matter, as a way of keeping people in line. But he never actually persecuted anyone on religious grounds. He was actually an extremely tolerant man. In the 1530s, that was a very unusual point of view. He was actually a very good king. The last statue, a rather poorly dressed young lady. Abundance. Abundance of what, you ask? Well, come back to that statue of King James at the left there. That bearded old man. And bear in mind, James actually saw that statue being made and he approved it. And it looks nothing like him. He died at the age of 30, so what's going on here? This is the king's private joke. He would actually go in disguise into the towns and the villages. He would talk to the common folk, understand their problems, govern the country better. He was actually a very good king. But he also managed, by the time of his death, at 30 years old, to be the father of more than 300 illegitimate children. It's good to be the king. Quite literally the father of his nation. So, as I say, this wall gives you good government. James V is giving you peace and prosperity, alliance with France, allegiance to the Catholic Church, and abundance of mostly naked ladies. As political policies in the world go, I've heard of worse. Let's look at the King's Old Building. In the old records, it's shown as the King's House. That's exactly what it is. It's the first attempt at comfortable living here in the rock, getting away from those old medieval towers. In fact, in the early Middle Ages there was a tower in this corner here. But that's knocked down. The Kings want something more comfortable, so this building is built. Now, it's been very heavily modified over the centuries. It's always been almost entirely rebuilt on at least 2 occasions. But there are parts of it still surprisingly old. The end wall on this side, if we look at that later, it actually goes back to the 1300s. The 2 white painted windows, open door, gents' toilets. Actually, the main gents' toilets, the castle. Ladies, just into the corner there. They've both been recently refurbished, very comfortable, very nice. However, the ladies' toilets have one slight advantage over the gents' toilets, in that the gents' toilets are now listed as the most haunted toilets in Scotland. You're on your own. However, what's now the gents' toilets with a slight problem was in fact originally part of the royal kitchens. The tower was, as it still is, the main entrance and staircase, but look just to the right of the present open door, you get the blocked ornamental doorway of the original entrance. Why and when that changed, we don't know. The record's been lost, but it certainly was a long time ago. In the middle part, we've got a row of doors and windows. These were storage cellars. And then from first floor level to the roof, well, there's obviously 3 floors in there. It was in fact one room. There was green glazed tiles upon the floor. There's a hammer beam roof. That is the Great Hall of King James II and James III, early mid-1400s, well before the one behind you was built. And then at this end, well, there's obviously newer stonework. There was a fire in the 1850s, and that end of the building was destroyed and then rebuilt by the Victorians. And that's a tragedy, because that was the royal apartments, and of course we've lost them, they're gone. You see at the back there's a rough stone wall and a black drain pipe, and below and to the left of the drain pipe, 2 locked windows. That is some of the last evidence we have of what was the King's apartments. However, somewhere in there, one of Stirling's darkest deeds took place. Because in the early 1400s, the most powerful family in the kingdom is not the royal family, the Stuarts. The most powerful family in the kingdom was in fact the Douglas family. My lord, the Earl of Douglas, the Black Douglas he was called, owned southern Scotland. Not only that, but in France, he's went off to fight alongside the French army of Joan of Arc, gained great renown, become the Duke of Turenne, the only non-French royal in history to have held that title. He's become Commander-in-Chief of the French armies. He has a personal alliance with the Pope. Serious connections in the early 1400s. None of that glory is going back to the Stuart family, you understand. It's all the Douglases. And here in Scotland, the Stuarts and the Douglases is heading for civil war. So in order to stop this, King James II, he sends a safe conduct to his cousin William, the Earl of Douglas. He invites him here to Stirling Castle for a peace conference. Tuesday, 22nd of February 1452, William Douglas is wined and dined in the hall here. And then the King and the Earl retire into one of the rooms at the back with a jug of wine to sit down and discuss their problems. Well, as the night wears on, the King is not getting the answer he wants to hear. He drew his dagger, he stabbed the Earl of Douglas twice. A cry went up, the door flew open, the other courtiers came rushing in, saw what the King had done, and they joined in. And Douglas fell to the ground with 26 wounds in his body and an axe in his head. Drenched in blood, they picked that body up, they threw it out of the window to the garden outside. To this day it's called the Douglas Garden. To the King, this is not the end of the problem, because the Earl of Douglas had 4 brothers. They're not impressed. They took that safe conduct, they tied it to a horse's tail, they dragged it through the dirt here to Stirling Castle. On St Patrick's Day of 1452, the 4 Douglas brothers with 600 men sat on their horses outside the castle and invited the King to come out for a little talk. He said no. The Douglases renounced their allegiance, declared war, and then burned the town of Stirling to the ground. The castle held out. There then followed a 3-year civil war which devastated southern Scotland, which finally the King won. But it was a very, very narrow victory. And from then on in, King James was a bit more careful about stabbing dinner guests. Nasty little man. Come